The aircraft hummed softly, cruising through the sky at 35,000 feet. The passengers relaxed, some enjoying their meals, others lost in conversation or deep in thought. The flight was smooth and uneventful, until something caught the attention of a few passengers sitting near the aisle. A flight attendant, dressed in a neatly pressed uniform, moved gracefully through the rows, offering drinks and food. Her smile was warm, but only for some. As she made her way down the aisle, her demeanor shifted suddenly when she approached a black woman seated by the window. Without a second glance, the flight attendant walked right past her, skipping her row entirely. The woman's tray table remained empty, while the passengers beside and behind her were served without hesitation. At first, the woman said nothing. She simply adjusted her posture and glanced down at her folded hands, as if expecting this. But a few eyes in the cabin had already noticed. A well-dressed businessman, sitting a few rows ahead, lowered his newspaper slightly, his eyes peering over the edge. He had been observing everything in silence, his face unreadable. A young man seated across the aisle narrowed his eyes. His hands instinctively went to his phone, tilting the camera just enough to capture what was happening. The flight attendant returned a moment later with another tray, but once again, she ignored the black woman, serving the man beside her instead. The woman finally raised her hand politely, her voice calm yet firm. "Excuse me, miss." The flight attendant paused for a moment, but didn't look at her directly. Instead, she sighed, adjusting her name tag before finally turning around. "Yes?" she asked, her tone clipped and indifferent. The woman gestured toward her empty tray table. "I believe you missed me when you were serving." A brief silence. A faint smirk flickered across the flight attendant's lips, but only for a second. She tilted her head slightly, glancing at the tray as if she had only now realized it was empty. "Oh," she said, her voice laced with feigned surprise. "I guess I must have overlooked you." The businessman folded his newspaper neatly, placing it on his lap. His gaze was still locked on the scene. The black woman offered a polite smile, choosing not to react to the dismissive tone. "No problem," she replied. "Could I have a water, please?" The flight attendant's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. She turned without a word, but instead of fetching the water, she continued down the aisle, serving others as if nothing had happened. The young man across the aisle glanced at his phone screen. The recording had already begun. He zoomed in slightly, capturing the look on the black woman's face, a look of deep but quiet frustration. The businessman slowly leaned back in his seat. His fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. His eyes followed the flight attendant, but he said nothing. "Not yet." A few rows behind, an older gentleman shook his head disapprovingly. He opened his mouth, perhaps about to say something, but hesitated. The tension in the cabin had shifted subtly, like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. And the storm was coming. The hum of the aircraft faded into the background, drowned out by the unspoken tension in the air. The flight attendant continued her rounds, handing out drinks and snacks with a bright smile, but only to certain passengers. The black woman sat still, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. Her hands rested lightly on the tray table, as if waiting, not for the water, but for something else. Across the aisle, the young man with the phone kept recording. His grip on the device tightened slightly as he focused on the interaction. He had seen discrimination before, but to witness it so openly on a flight? It made his chest tighten. Further up, the well-dressed businessman sat back, his fingers gently tapping on the armrest, his eyes following the flight attendant's movements with quiet intensity. The plane jolted slightly as the pilot adjusted course. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling an announcement, but no one paid attention. Their focus was now on the aisle. The black woman tried again. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. The flight attendant barely glanced over her shoulder. "I'll get to you in a moment," she replied flatly, her voice dripping with irritation. But she never did. Instead, she walked back to the service cart, chuckling under her breath. Another attendant, a younger woman with a concerned expression, whispered something to her. The dismissive flight attendant just waved it off, rolling her eyes. The businessman's jaw tensed, though he remained silent. Meanwhile, the young man across the aisle whispered to the elderly gentleman nearby. "You see that?" he murmured, tilting his phone slightly to show the screen. The older man adjusted his glasses, frowning. He watched the replay, a clear recording of the flight attendant skipping the black woman, then brushing her off when she asked for service. "That's just wrong," the older man muttered, shaking his head. "And she thinks nobody's noticing?" "Oh, someone's noticing," the young man replied, nodding toward the businessman. The wealthy-looking man had not spoken, but his expression had changed. The calculated silence, the slight crease in his brow, the faint tap of his fingers against the seat's leather, these were the signs of someone who was taking mental notes. Then, finally, he moved. He slowly unfastened his seatbelt, stood up, and adjusted his cuffs. His posture was casual but deliberate. The young man stopped recording for a moment and simply watched. The flight attendant, still chatting with her colleague, barely noticed the businessman stepping into the aisle. But the black woman did. For the first time since the flight began, she looked up at him. And for the briefest moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a look that lasted only a heartbeat. The businessman met her gaze for a split second. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the flight attendant's station. The young man with the phone swallowed hard. Something was about to happen. And this time, the flight attendant wasn't going to get away with it. The businessman's polished shoes barely made a sound as he strode down the narrow aisle. His movements were calm, controlled, yet there was an undeniable weight to them. The black woman's gaze followed him, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The flight attendant, still laughing softly with her colleague, only noticed him when he stopped right beside her. "Oh," she said, her tone shifting slightly. She straightened, smoothing her uniform. "Is there something I can get for you, sir?" The businessman's expression remained neutral. He glanced at the service cart, where plenty of water bottles and drinks sat untouched. His voice was smooth but firm. "I noticed a passenger in 12A hasn't been served yet." The flight attendant blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, she stole a quick glance toward the black woman, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I was just about to get to her." The businessman raised an eyebrow, his silence stretching the moment into something tense and uncomfortable. The young man across the aisle hit record again, sensing something big about to unfold. The older gentleman, now fully invested, leaned in slightly, waiting. "You were about to get to her," the businessman repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "That's odd, considering I've been watching you for the past 15 minutes. A ripple of unease passed through the flight attendant's confident demeanor. I must have been distracted," she tried, forcing a smile. "It wasn't intentional." The businessman's gaze didn't waver. "Interesting," he said, tapping the service cart lightly. "Because I've also noticed you haven't been distracted when serving anyone else." The words hung in the air. Passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but the entire row was now eerily quiet. The flight attendant's smile faltered, and for the first time, she looked nervous. "I assure you, sir, there's no issue here," she said quickly. The businessman took a slow, measured breath. Then he leaned in slightly and, in a voice only she could hear, he murmured. "Are you certain about that?" The flight attendant's eyes widened ever so slightly, as if she suddenly realized that this wasn't just another passenger complaining. For a split second, she seemed to struggle for a response. Then, she grabbed a water bottle from the cart and forced a tight-lipped smile. "Here, I'll take care of it now," she said, moving toward the black woman's seat. But as she stepped forward, the businessman's hand casually rested on the cart, stopping her movement. "No need," he said smoothly. "I'll do it myself." The flight attendant froze, her face paling slightly. Passengers exchanged glances, curiosity piqued. The businessman took the bottle from the cart and, without another word, turned and walked back down the aisle, straight toward the black woman's seat. She watched him approach, her expression unreadable. The young man with the phone zoomed in, his heart pounding with anticipation. The businessman stopped in front of the black woman's row, and for a moment, they just looked at each other. Then, finally, he extended the water bottle toward her. "I believe this was meant for you," he said simply. The woman studied him, her gaze searching. Then, slowly, she reached out and took the bottle, her fingers brushing lightly against his as she did. "Thank you," she said softly. The businessman nodded once, his face unreadable. But as he turned to walk back to his seat, the black woman's lips parted slightly, as if she was about to say something. And then she stopped herself. She merely sat back, holding the bottle, her expression now far more focused than before. Because something strange had just happened. Something not quite normal. And she wasn't the only one who noticed. The air inside the cabin felt different now, as if the very atmosphere had thickened with unspoken tension. Passengers who had been chatting just moments ago now exchanged quiet glances, sensing that something out of the ordinary was unfolding. The young man across the aisle kept his phone steady, his fingers gripping the edges as he recorded every moment. He didn't know who the businessman was, but he could feel it in his gut. This was more than just a simple act of kindness. The black woman sat still, the water bottle resting lightly in her hand. Her fingers tightened around it, her expression unreadable. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of deep thought, recognition, or maybe even suspicion. The flight attendant stood stiffly near the cart, her shoulders squared, her face flushed with unease. She had been expecting the usual, a quick complaint, maybe a small argument, something she could brush off with a forced apology. But this was something different. She swallowed hard, watching the businessman return to his seat without another word. He settled in, smoothing his suit jacket, then adjusted the silver cufflinks on his wrists, a motion so effortless, so natural, yet it sent a silent message of control and power. The young man recording the video zoomed in slightly, his curiosity rising. There was something familiar about those cufflinks. The black woman took a sip of water, her throat dry, her mind racing with thoughts she wasn't ready to voice yet. And then a soft chime echoed through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking," a deep voice resonated through the aircraft. "We'd like to take a moment to welcome a very special guest aboard today's flight. As some of you may know, our airline has recently undergone some exciting changes, and we are honored to have one of our largest investors flying with us today." The young man's jaw tensed. The flight attendant paled. Passengers sat straighter in their seats, murmurs passing through the cabin. And the black woman? She exhaled slowly, closing her eyes for just a brief moment, as if she already knew what was coming. The captain continued. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join us in welcoming Mr. Businessman's last name, who has played a significant role in shaping our company's future." The moment the name was spoken, the flight attendant's entire body stiffened. Her hands gripped the edge of the cart, her breath caught mid-inhale. The businessman remained still, his face calm, his hands lightly resting on the armrest. But when he finally turned his gaze toward the flight attendant, his expression was ice-cold. And in that moment, she knew. She hadn't just ignored any passenger. She had ignored one of the most powerful figures in the airline industry. The black woman lifted her gaze, finally allowing herself to meet the businessman's eyes. And for the first time, the faintest hint of a smirk touched her lips. Because she, too, had known all along, the announcement echoed through the cabin, leaving a trail of stunned silence in its wake. Passengers who had been half distracted only moments ago were now fully alert, their eyes darting between the wealthy businessman and the flight attendant who had just been exposed. The black woman took another slow sip of water, her expression still unreadable. But there was something different now, a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. The flight attendant's pulse pounded in her ears. Her hands felt clammy, her throat dry. She had ignored him. Disrespected him. And worse, she had done it in front of an entire plane full of people. The businessman's fingers drummed lightly against the armrest, his face calm but unreadable. He had said very little so far. But the weight of his silence was crushing. The young man across the aisle, still recording, let out a low whistle under his breath. "Oh, this is about to get interesting," he murmured, tilting the camera just enough to capture the flight attendant's pale, horrified expression. The older gentleman beside him adjusted his glasses, shaking his head. "She had no idea who she was dealing with," he muttered. The flight attendant forced a tight smile, trying to salvage what was left of her professionalism. "Yes, sir," she stammered, I had no idea you were on board. If I had known." The businessman tilted his head slightly, studying her with an unsettling, unreadable gaze. "If you had known," he repeated. His voice was calm, dangerously even. The flight attendant froze, realizing her mistake. If she had known, what? That he was someone important? That she should have treated him differently? That she only respected passengers based on their status? She swallowed hard. I only meant. But the businessman held up a hand, silencing her. "I don't care what you meant," he said smoothly. The cabin felt deathly silent. Passengers barely breathed, sensing the tension tighten like a vice. The flight attendant's face flushed with embarrassment. "Yes, sir, I would like to sincerely apologize." The businessman leaned forward slightly, his voice low but sharp. "Apologize," he mused. "Interesting. Because I don't recall you apologizing to the passenger in 12A. The black woman remained seated, her posture graceful, poised. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The flight attendant's eyes flickered toward her, and for the first time, true panic set in. Because she finally understood. She hadn't just ignored a passenger. She had ignored the wrong passenger. The black woman wasn't just anyone. And suddenly, the flight attendant felt like she was standing on a cliff's edge, staring down into the abyss. The businessman sat back, his expression turning cold and calculating. "I wonder," he said softly, "what the airline's board of directors would think if they saw how their staff treats certain customers." The flight attendant visibly tensed, her fingers clenching the edge of the cart. The passengers watched in silence, their expressions a mix of fascination, discomfort, and quiet satisfaction. The young man with the phone? He just kept recording. Because he knew. This wasn't over yet. The cabin air felt heavy, thick with the weight of unspoken truths. The flight attendant stood frozen, her grip tightening around the edge of the cart as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. The businessman's cold stare bore into her, unflinching, merciless. And yet, the black woman remained silent. She sat gracefully, her hands lightly resting on the water bottle. Composed. Calm. Almost amused. Like someone who already knew the outcome before the game even started. The flight attendant's voice came out in a weak, trembling attempt. "Sir, I can assure you, this was just a misunderstanding. I didn't mean to." The businessman didn't blink. Didn't move. Instead, he did something that sent an icy chill up the flight attendant's spine. He pulled out his phone. The screen lit up, the glow reflecting off the silver cufflinks on his wrist. He tapped the screen once, then held the phone to his ear. The flight attendant's breath caught in her throat. Passengers exchanged looks. The young man across the aisle kept recording, eyes wide with anticipation. And then the businessman spoke into the phone, his voice eerily calm. "Put me through to corporate." The flight attendant visibly swayed, her face drained of color. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder, passengers now fully invested in the spectacle unfolding before them. She knew what this meant. A direct line to corporate. A complaint from an investor. Her career was hanging by a thread. She had to do something. Fast. She turned, scrambling for control, her eyes darting to the black woman. I sincerely apologize, ma'am," she stammered, her voice wavering. I didn't mean to be disrespectful. It was a mistake." The black woman finally looked up, meeting the flight attendant's frantic gaze. And for the first time, she spoke. "A mistake," she repeated softly. Her tone was neutral, not angry, not accusatory. But it was the kind of calm that sent a deeper chill down the flight attendant's spine. The black woman's fingers tapped lightly on the water bottle. "A mistake," she continued, "would be spilling a drink on someone." Her gaze never wavered. "A mistake," she said again, slower this time, "would be forgetting a passenger's request once." She tilted her head, studying the woman standing before her. But deliberately skipping over someone? Dismissing them? Refusing service? Her voice remained soft, but the words cut like a blade. The businessman lowered his phone slightly, observing. The flight attendant's lips trembled, her body tense with panic. I truly didn't mean." The black woman leaned forward slightly, resting her elbow on the armrest. And then, she smiled. Not out of kindness. Not out of forgiveness. But out of knowing. Knowing exactly what was about to happen next. And for the first time, the flight attendant understood too. The weight of her choices. The weight of her actions. The fact that she had underestimated the wrong people. The businessman lifted his phone again, his voice sharp. "I need a name," he said. The flight attendant's knees nearly buckled. Because she knew. She wasn't walking away from this. The flight attendant's chest tightened, her breath shallow and unsteady. She had handled dozens of flights before, dismissing passengers she deemed unimportant, skating by on nothing but arrogance and confidence. But this time she had picked the wrong flight. The businessman's voice was crisp, unwavering as he spoke into his phone. "Yes. I need her full name." The words hit like a hammer, each syllable chipping away at the flight attendant's last shred of control. Passengers were no longer whispering, they were openly watching now, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and quiet satisfaction. The young man with the phone leaned forward, his camera still rolling. The black woman sat back, her posture as elegant as ever. She took another sip of water, as if she had all the time in the world. The flight attendant's pulse pounded in her ears. If her name went up the chain, she was done. A termination on record. A ruined career. A stain that wouldn't wash away. Please, sir," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I made a mistake." The businessman's gaze didn't soften. "That's already been established," he replied. The words felt like a final nail in a coffin. The flight attendant felt her throat closing, her hands trembling. Her mind raced for a way out, something, anything, to stop the inevitable. Then, in one last desperate attempt, she turned to the black woman, her voice shaking. "Ma'am, please," she said, nearly pleading. If you could just forgive me. I swear it won't happen again." The businessman's expression remained unreadable, but his hand paused over the phone screen, as if waiting. The black woman, for the first time, set the water bottle down. Passengers held their breath. The young man with the phone gripped the edges of his seat. The air felt still, like the moment before a storm breaks. Then she spoke. "I don't need your apology," the black woman said softly. The flight attendant's face crumbled. The woman's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something far worse than anger. Disappointment. "I've seen your type before," the black woman continued. Her voice was calm, but powerful. "People who think power is about choosing who deserves respect." She leaned forward slightly, her next words cutting like a razor blade. "But real power is knowing when to give someone a second chance." The businessman tilted his head slightly, listening. The flight attendant felt her stomach churn. She was bracing for the final blow, a complete public humiliation, an announcement that she was being removed from the flight, blacklisted from the airline, destroyed in an instant. But instead, the black woman exhaled slowly, before turning to the businessman. "She doesn't need to be fired," she said simply. The businessman's brow lifted slightly. The flight attendant's eyes widened. "She needs to learn," the black woman continued. "Properly." Passengers stared in disbelief. Even the young man lowered his phone slightly, stunned. The flight attendant's knees nearly buckled. The businessman finally spoke, his voice measured, calculated. "You're letting her off?" The black woman smiled faintly. "No," she said. "I'm making sure she remembers this day for the rest of her life." She turned back to the flight attendant, her tone gentle, but firm. "You're going to go through diversity training. Real training. Not just a seminar to check off a corporate requirement." She paused, letting the words settle. "You're going to listen to the people you've dismissed," she continued. "And you're going to learn what respect really looks like." The flight attendant opened her mouth, but no words came out. The black woman wasn't angry. She was giving her a chance. A real chance. The businessman watched her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he put his phone away. A sign. A decision had been made. Passengers exhaled, some nodding, others murmuring quietly. The young man across the aisle smiled to himself. He had gotten it all on camera, but the real story wasn't about revenge. It was about something bigger. Something worth sharing. The black woman picked up her water bottle again, turning back to the window. And just like that, it was over. The tension lingered in the air, even as the confrontation seemed to end. The flight attendant stood frozen, her eyes darting between the black woman and the businessman, as if still trying to process what had just happened. She had expected rage, humiliation, or outright dismissal. Instead, she had been given a chance, one she wasn't sure she deserved. The businessman adjusted his cuffs, his expression still unreadable. His silence spoke volumes. He was watching, evaluating. The black woman turned her gaze back to the window, her posture relaxed, as if completely unbothered by the storm she had just walked through. Passengers around them began to shift, whispering amongst themselves. The young man with the phone slowly lowered his device, glancing at the older gentleman beside him. "She really let her off the hook," he muttered, shaking his head. The older man chuckled softly. "No, son. She did something much worse." The young man raised an eyebrow. "She made her live with it," the older man said simply. The flight attendant staggered slightly, her hand still gripping the cart as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. She felt exposed, as though her entire career had been placed under a magnifying glass, and the whole world had just seen her true reflection. She knew what came next. The training. The reports. The consequences. She wouldn't lose her job today. But she would never forget this moment. A soft chime echoed through the cabin, signaling an incoming announcement. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice hummed through the speakers, "we will begin our descent shortly. Please make sure your seats are in their upright position and your seatbelts are fastened." The flight attendant took a deep, shaky breath. She had a choice to make. To pretend this never happened, or to change. Her eyes flickered back toward the black woman, who hadn't said another word since the conversation ended. A small, hesitant voice in the back of her mind whispered. She had every reason to destroy me, but she didn't. The black woman had been graceful, powerful, and in control. She had proved true power didn't come from status, but from wisdom. And for the first time, the flight attendant saw herself for what she truly was. Small. She swallowed hard. "Ma'am," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The black woman turned slightly, raising an eyebrow. The flight attendant's face burned with shame, but she forced herself to hold her gaze. I want to say that I'm sorry. This time, it was real. No script. No forced apology. Just words wrapped in the weight of guilt and understanding. The black woman studied her for a long moment. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she nodded once. The flight attendant exhaled, relief washing over her like a tide. It wasn't much. But it was a start. The young man across the aisle smirked, nudging the older gentleman. Guess you were right. The older man simply smiled. Wisdom beats power, every time. The businessman finally shifted in his seat, glancing down at his watch. His work here was done. As the flight continued its descent, passengers settled into their seats, the tension slowly dissolving into quiet reflection. And yet, everyone on board knew this wasn't just another flight. Something had changed. Something that would echo long after they landed. The plane touched down smoothly, the wheels skimming the runway before settling into a gentle, rolling stop. The passengers stirred, stretching and gathering their belongings, the usual post-flight chatter filling the cabin. But there was something different this time, a lingering sense of reflection, as if the events in the air had left a mark that no one could quite put into words. The black woman remained seated, watching as the other passengers prepared to leave. Her expression was calm, composed, but there was an unmistakable certainty in her eyes. She had made her point. And everyone on that flight had heard it loud and clear. The flight attendant stood near the exit, her posture unusually stiff. She had greeted passengers with empty pleasantries on hundreds of flights before. But this time, she was watching faces, watching reactions. Watching the way people acknowledged her, or didn't. She saw the young man with the phone, still watching her, a knowing look on his face. She saw the older gentleman, who gave her a single, pointed nod as he passed. And then, she saw her. The black woman approached the exit, her steps unrushed, effortless. For a moment, the flight attendant thought she would simply walk past her, without another word. But at the very last second, she stopped. The two women faced each other, and for the first time, the flight attendant met her eyes without flinching. The black woman's gaze was steady, unreadable. Then, in the softest, yet most piercing voice imaginable, she said, "Next time, treat people with dignity first." A single sentence. A final lesson. The words weren't spoken as a threat. They weren't spoken with malice. But they carried the weight of something irreversible. Because the flight attendant knew. This moment would live in her mind forever. A reminder. A reckoning. A crossroads. The black woman gave her one last look, then turned and walked away. The flight attendant's throat tightened, her hands trembling slightly as she nodded to the next passenger, her voice weak. "Thank you for flying with us." The businessman exited a few moments later, his cufflinks gleaming under the airport lights. He didn't spare her a glance, his lesson had already been delivered. As the last of the passengers left, the flight attendant slumped against the wall, pressing a shaky hand to her forehead. She knew she wouldn't be fired today. She knew she'd be sent to training, to meetings, to uncomfortable conversations about behavior and consequences. But more than that, she knew she had crossed a line she could never erase. She had been blind before. Now, she could finally see. And for the first time in her career, she truly understood what it meant to serve others.